Welcome back to It's Not Normal, the podcast, episode 13. In this week's episode, we are getting into everything related to perfectionism. And before I get into it, I just want to take a quick minute to thank everyone who's been tuning in so far. We are 13 episodes in, and I'm so proud of everything that we've been able to do with this podcast so far. If you've been enjoying these episodes, please be sure to like this video, or if you're listening on Spotify, to leave us a rating, subscribe to our YouTube channel. We are still very much in the early days of this conversation, and your support goes a really long way. So thank you all so much. Let's get into the episode. I want to start this off by saying, generally, there are many different forms of perfectionism, and they stem from different things. Perfectionism isn't something that in every single case is directly tied to having a narcissistic parent or growing up in an emotionally unskilled family. There are a number of different causes or roots of perfectionism, and I think that these things can develop and manifest themselves in our lives in different ways. It's not as black and white of a topic as some of the other things that we've discussed, but I am going to be talking about the different forms of perfectionism and relating it back in my own personal experience to how I think it stemmed from growing up with a narcissistic parent. In the research that I've done, I've come across 3 different types of perfectionism, and they're relatively self-explanatory. There's self-oriented, other-oriented, and socially oriented. Self-oriented perfectionism is when someone is highly critical of themselves. Other-oriented perfectionism is when someone is highly critical of others, and socially oriented perfectionism is when someone believes that everyone else expects them to be perfect, and so they pressure themselves to, in fact, be perfect. And within those 3 forms of perfectionism, there are kind of 2 offshoots. One being healthy or adaptive perfectionism, and the other being unhealthy or maladaptive perfectionism. So talking about someone who deals with healthy or adaptive perfectionism, right? That looks more something like someone who is goal-oriented, who challenges themselves and does set high expectations for themselves, but they're manageable, they're achievable. And these kinds of people are much more focused on the process, right? Everything that's going on behind the scenes to get them to achieve their goal. The process itself is of equal or greater importance than the actual outcome. And if someone dealing with healthy perfectionism fails, they're going to take their failures as a learning experience. They're going to remain engaged in the activity. Whereas someone dealing with maladaptive or unhealthy perfectionism sets incredibly high, lofty, unrealistic expectations and goals for themselves, oftentimes setting themselves up for failure, and they are so much more focused on the outcome. They're very outcome-oriented, outcome-focused, where whatever it is that they're trying to achieve, the end goal is exponentially more important than the process or the journey of getting there. And so often they're not focused on what they're doing in the moment, rather they're so focused on what's coming in the future. And if someone who deals with maladaptive, this unhealthier version of perfectionism fails, there's kind of 2 paths that they might take. One, they might be completely obsessed with this activity now, where they've tried something and they've failed. And so now they're turning it up a notch, and it's like, I have to master this. I have to put even more time and energy into this. I have to learn every single aspect of it because I don't want to fail again. And so they become completely obsessive, or they avoid the activity altogether. They kind of shut down and run away from it because the failure is too much. The failure is not looked at as something positive, as growth, right? As a clear indication that you're trying and that you're trying something new. And so those are kind of the main types or forms of perfectionism that I have come across in the research that I have done. And so this begs the question, how is perfectionism related to growing up or being raised by a narcissistic parent? And the first thing that comes to mind is the idea of the golden child. Now, something that I've been meaning to clarify is I have said several times that I think I fulfilled the role of the golden child within my narcissistic family for the majority of my time living with my parents. In the research that I've been doing lately about golden children, I've spoken to a couple of people about what it actually means to be a golden child also. I think that I didn't necessarily fulfill that role fully. Instead, I received what I'm going to call golden child treatment. Because a golden child is placed high up on a pedestal. They can do no wrong. And while there were times that I did feel like that within my family dynamic, if I ever said no and really held true to that no, or if I ever made a decision that felt more true to me that my narcissistic parent disagreed with, I was no longer the golden child. I became more of a scapegoat. I was guilt-tripped, I was shamed, I was blamed for things, and that is not treatment that golden children receive. And so when I was in good standing with my parent, which was often because I was conditioned to behave in a certain way, I was fearful of making mistakes or doing anything wrong, that was when I felt as if I was the golden child, looking back. But I think understanding a little bit more what it truly means to be a golden child, I think I more so received golden child treatment, while maybe always being sort of this underlying scapegoat. That being said, I definitely do think that I inherited a lot of the characteristics and traits that go along with being the golden child in a narcissistic family dynamic. And so the first thing that comes to mind is the idea of conditional love and expectations, where you earn your love with a narcissistic parent. You are not simply loved for who you are, but rather what you supply them with. What can you do for your parent that's going to benefit them, that in return, you'll receive love and affection from them. And so you have to work hard to prove yourself and to earn your love. And if you ever do or say or believe anything that deviates from that of your narcissistic parent, they will withhold that love and care and affection that children crave from their parents. And so perfectionism in that way relates not only to having a narcissistic parent, but also fulfilling that golden child role where you're always trying to do everything to the best of your ability because these expectations have been put on you, whether they're academic expectations, whether they're expectations within your family dynamic, the role that you're supposed to fulfill, what you can or should be doing for your narcissistic parent. When those expectations are met or exceeded, that is when you receive love from your parent. Otherwise, that love is withheld. And so I think it's really easy to kind of get obsessed with these expectations and to make sure that you're always doing everything to the best of your abilities. And I think perfectionism in this kind of environment is also used as a bit of a coping mechanism, because growing up with a narcissistic parent or a controlling parent in general, every single thing that you do is watched and observed and scrutinized. And so you never feel like you have a moment to just relax and kind of take a deep breath, take the mask off, take the costume off, and just be yourself. And I was thinking about it a bit last night, and it made me think of an actor or an actress in a play, right? Where maybe once a day or a couple times on the weekend, you've got this hour or two block where, okay, I'm performing. I'm putting on this role. I'm putting on this costume, and then I'm going out on stage, and everyone is going to be there watching me. Maybe they're going to be picking apart the way that I say things, my tone, how I look, right? Everything is kind of up for observation and maybe even for scrutiny because you're putting yourself in a position to be watched by other people. And I think what's so exhausting about growing up in that kind of environment as a child, where that's your relationship with your parents, is that you never have that break. It's not like, okay, Friday, Saturday night, and maybe Sunday afternoon, right? For an hour or two each day, I have to be on top of my game. Right? I have to memorize all my lines. I have to say them right. I have to say them in the right tone. My facial expressions have to be on. And then once it's done, right, I can kind of take it all off and return to my normal life and be myself and breathe this sigh of relief that the performance is over. But growing up with a narcissistic parent, the performance is never over. Every moment is an eggshell moment. And so you're constantly aware, not only of the expectations that have been placed on you that you're trying so hard to meet and exceed, but also just these daily monotonous tasks. You're always aware of what you're doing, how you're doing them, what you're saying, who's around, because everything is always so volatile. It's like everything is moving at all times, and you're trying your best to juggle a million different responsibilities at the same time. And it makes me think about school and my relationship to school. If you asked any of my teachers, even still, what kind of a student I was. They would tell you that I was a conscientious student, I was very smart, I was always on time, I enjoyed learning, I participated, right? Like I was a very good student. And I think back, I graduated at the top of my class in high school. We had a graduating class of over 600 students, and I graduated first in my class with a GPA of 102. And why? Not because I was the smartest or the best when it came to history or English. There were times where I didn't even get through the books, right? I didn't fully understand what the author meant when he used this literary technique in this, or they described this character in this certain way. A lot of those things went over my head, right? I wasn't necessarily a specialist or the best in any one particular subject. The reason that I graduated at the top of my class is because I'm a perfectionist, and because even then I was a perfectionist. And so even if I couldn't get through a book and I didn't understand what they were saying, I was going to ask someone who knew what the book was about, right? Like, what is this about? Can you help me? Or if not, I'm going to do hours of research until I feel comfortable enough that I'm going to perform well on the test. And I think it's reinforced. It's a bit of a side note, but I think this is reinforced by the education system in the United States, where every single teacher teaches to the test. And it's not the teacher's fault. It's the way that the system is set up, right? Where we are graded and our value directly correlates to how well we perform on standardized tests. And I think that's maybe loosely why there is such a connection between children of narcissistic parents and overachievers. Because you're applying that same mentality where it's, I am so much less focused, and not only I, but my teacher as well, right? My entire school, all the staff, all the members were not only focused on the process of learning, right? And the journey of getting there and understanding all of the steps really thoroughly and what this means. We're more so concerned about how you perform on this test at the end of the year. So again, you're not necessarily focused on the process. You are much more outcome oriented. You're concerned with the end result much more than anything in between. And so I was never the smartest in any one particular subject, but I never went into school unprepared. And if that meant doing 6 hours of studying the night before a test just so I could go in there sure enough that I was going to get 100, that's exactly what I would do, because anything less than that I viewed as a failure. I wouldn't be happy with my performance if it was anything less than perfect. And I think that even translates. I had perfect attendance in 8th grade. And I missed out on going to my high school orientation because my principal told me, well, if you know that you're going there, then there's really no reason that you need to go for orientation. So that won't be an excused absence. And that would have been my one day absent in my 8th grade year. And I would have missed out on like a certificate or a plaque at graduation or something like that. But even the name, right? Perfect attendance. Why is it that attending every single day of school, voluntarily missing out on what could have been a formative or an informational experience, going to the high school and, walking around with someone who kind of maybe could have mentored me a little bit? Why is it that missing out on something like that is tied to the word perfect, right? I feel like missing out on that for me was just like, okay, well then I won't go because I want to be perfect, because I don't want to miss a single day, because I'm viewing this as one huge thing instead of individual experiences. There are different types of trauma when you deal with any kind of emotional abuse or manipulation, and attachment trauma is one of them. And I think when you grow up with a narcissistic parent, you learn that everything you do is a reflection of who you are as a person, and those things can be used either for or against you. And so if you do something right, for anyone who's listening on Spotify, we've got air quotes going up around right, something that your narcissistic parent deems as right, you then are a good person, right? And you are in a safe environment. But if you do something wrong, again, here we are with the air quotes, something wrong, you're a bad person. And what's so confusing about this is there are times when you can ask your parent to do something. You can ask them a question, an opinion-based question. And on one day, if they're in a good mood, they'll say, yeah, sure, that's fine. No reaction or minimal reaction, and the topic comes and goes. Fast forward to a few days later, maybe a few weeks later, and you ask the same question. Oh, can I go out and do this thing that I did 2 weeks ago? Same question. You might get a drastically different reaction. Because if your parent is in a bad mood, right? If something didn't go their way in those couple of weeks or whatever it is, it might be a personal issue. It might be an issue that they're having with a relationship or finances. Anything that could be affecting how they're feeling about themselves is then going to inform their decision or their reaction to your question. And so it's so unpredictable because even with the same topic and the same question, in the same couple of days in a very small time frame, you can get two wildly different responses from the same person. And so there's a level of unpredictability that goes hand in hand with being raised by a narcissistic parent that is so exhausting. And I've read a lot about how when you're out of that environment and you're finally safe and your nervous system can start to heal and regulate itself, you might feel entirely exhausted and for an extended period of time. And talking about things like this out loud, right? Saying these things out loud makes that so clear to me, because if you're constantly on edge, right? We said before, every moment is an eggshell moment. So you're always fearful that something can happen at any given moment. And that stress is just never ending. It maybe only stops when you sleep, right? But even so, I think your body carries that stress even if your mind is at ease. You're never given an opportunity to take the costume off, to take the mask off, and to breathe that sigh of relief, because it is a never-ending performance. It makes so much sense why so many of us struggle with identity and our sense of self. Because for so long, what we did, our actions, were a direct reflection of who we were as people, right? Where our self-worth and how we felt about ourselves directly related to what we were doing, what we were producing, and other people's opinions of us and of those things. And it's so confusing because you lack that self-trust, you lack that gut instinct, and you're kind of advised against it. And the reason I think so many times is because narcissistic parents or controlling parents in general are very selfish. And it makes me think of when I was in high school and I was applying for colleges, right? I was in my senior year and the application time was coming around and I had to start thinking about what I wanted to do, where I wanted to go. And there were a number of different schools. Being such a perfectionist in school, right? My grades were really high and I felt like I could have gotten into a fair number of schools that I applied to. And the conversation about going away to school was never even on the table. If it was ever talked about, it was immediately shut down, because then I was viewed as a bad person for even entertaining the thought of leaving my family, right? Leaving my siblings and my parents and going to live away in a small room with a complete stranger for so much money. And so I didn't even want to be caught wanting that or entertaining the idea of that, because I thought then that I was a bad person because I was doing the wrong thing. Like I had my priorities all screwed up. And looking back at it, if I were to have gone away to school, right, where I couldn't commute and I had to be living away, maybe hours away from home, I would no longer be available to my parents, to my family. There's no supply there. There's no mediator for the arguments. There's no one around to regulate their emotions for them. And it's such a selfish decision, right? Because maybe even the controlling side of them, they're fearful of what I'm going to do when I'm out on my own. If I'm going to be gaining perspective and making new friends, and now I'm free to do whatever I want to do without having someone in my ear constantly or being able to observe everything that I'm doing all the time under the same roof. And maybe there's a level of sadness there where they're used to me being around all the time. And now if I go, they're going to be sad because they're going to miss me. And so all of those things combined are more important than putting those things aside, those more selfish desires aside, for the betterment of their kid. Right? Where maybe as a really great student who was always interested in learning, maybe going away to a really good school would have been beneficial for me. That could have changed my life and introduced me to new and different people. I could have had a lot of different opportunities. And so even if I felt like that was the right decision to make for me, and I expressed that to my parents, it wouldn't matter. They weren't willing to sacrifice their comfort or their control for my well-being. And so I felt pressured to not even want to make that decision because, again, my decisions and what I did and chose to do with my life was directly tied to how I was viewed by my parent and, in turn, the treatment that I received from them. And so I was a bad person if I wanted to go away to school. If I made the decision to stay and to commute so I could be closer to my family, then I was a good person. And having this track record throughout my life of always making the quote unquote right decision by my parent, right? It makes it even harder to give that up later in life because it's like I've come this far. These are the expectations of me. This is kind of like the image that I have to uphold. Enduring any kind of narcissistic abuse teaches you to be small and to hide who you truly are, to hide your true emotions or opinions on things. And relating this back to perfectionism, because the way that you feel about yourself, the things that you're told about the kind of person that you are or the treatment that you receive from really important people in your life, your parents, is directly tied to the decisions that you make. It makes you think over and over again about the things that you're putting out into the world, whether it's actions or decisions or words. You don't want to put anything out into the world unless it's just right, especially because you have that level of unpredictability that we talked about a little bit earlier, where you can go into something having a pretty fair idea of, okay, I know how this is going to go because we talked about this a couple of weeks ago, but still knowing that, you know what, I might get an entirely different reaction depending on the mood that my parent is in. So that heightens this kind of thought process before you say or do anything, because you want to minimize the possibility of anything going wrong, of anything negative happening, or of this situation somehow being turned back around on you, where now you're the center of attention, you're the focal point of this really negative experience. And so again, if I was thinking of going away to school and there was a little hint of, you're a bad person if that's something that you even want to do. If you're entertaining the idea of leaving your family, who does that, right? So knowing that the seed has been planted, now every time I think about anything related to going away to school or college, that is going to be in the forefront of my mind, right? Where I know I don't want to say anything or do anything or express an opinion of mine unless it's really well thought out, right? Unless I know that it's going to get, or at least I'm fairly certain that it's going to get a positive, or at least not a negative reaction from my parent. And this applies to everything. And I still find myself doing this where before I say anything, I think about, how is this going to be interpreted by whoever it is that I'm around? Is this negative or hurtful in any way? I think about every single thing that I say before I say it. And I think a lot of it has to do with this perfectionism that's a result of being raised by a narcissistic parent. Part of why it took me so long to start posting anything on social media, especially related to mental health. I shared a video not too long ago about the first video that I ever made talking about something like this. And it was back in October, I think, of 2022. And I posted my first TikTok on here talking about, narcissism and mental health in September, the end of September of 2023. And so it took me a year to feel comfortable enough to finally get behind the camera and just start talking. And I think perfectionism was really the root of that, where I had a lot of ideas about things that I wanted to talk about or that I could say that maybe other people could relate to or could benefit from. But either the setting wasn't right and I wasn't happy with what the video looked like or sounded like, or maybe I wasn't wearing, an outfit that translated well, or maybe I didn't use the right words. Maybe I could have communicated this in a better way. Right? And so there were so many factors where, I was always thinking about what I was saying, how I was saying it, how to best present it, what's the best format. I was so hypercritical of myself and the work that I was trying to do that I ended up avoiding it altogether. And that is kind of where we talk more about this maladaptive, unhealthy perfectionism, where I tried, but because of the overthinking, because of this level of criticism and this scrutiny that I was really just putting on myself, I ended up avoiding the entire thing for almost a year. And it takes a lot to let go of that fear. That fear that whatever I do can be used in a positive or a negative way against me, right? And who I am as a person might directly be tied to my work and the things that I'm putting out and the words that I'm using. And it's so hard to draw that line or to find some sort of separation between what I'm doing, right? The productive work that I'm doing, I guess, and just who I am as a person. Because for so long, you're not valued just for that. You're valued for what you do instead of who you are. And so there's this whole process of self-discovery, I think, that goes along with fighting that perfectionism, because you have to separate yourself from your goals and your expectations and your achievements, your accomplishments. You are not your work. You are not what you achieve and what you accomplish. You are you. And then everything else is on top of that. And so you can strip all of that away and still be left with a really kind, smart, ambitious person. You are not defined by your accomplishments. You are not defined by your accomplishments, and you can be loved and appreciated simply for the person that you are. And normally, people in your life are not going to withhold any kind of love or affection or support if you fail. Or I should say when you fail, because everyone fails at one point or another, and most people don't view failures as a negative. And that kind of leads me right into my next couple of points, which is how I personally have been able to start to heal, or at least fight perfectionism in my day-to-day life. And I think, just to tie it back, I guess, to what we started the episode talking about, I think that I've dealt with a bit of self-oriented perfectionism. I definitely have extremely high expectations for myself. Socially oriented perfectionism. I think, having grown up in a narcissistic family, I think that other people expect me to be perfect, to be performing at my peak at all times. And I think there is a part of my personality that has developed out of my experiences in life that is leaning a little bit more towards the adaptive perfectionism, where it is healthy, right? I enjoy challenging myself and setting goals for myself. Something that I'm working on is focusing more on the process than the outcome. And I think, again, that was why I struggled to start posting things online, because I was so focused on the finished product and I really wasn't thinking as much about the process, about what goes into it. And I like to remain engaged, regardless of failures. But there's definitely a part of me, I guess it's a little bit more deep-seated, where, it's this unhealthy perfectionism where my goals inside, I know on the surface that it's okay if I don't get all of these things done. But there is still a part of me that feels like if I don't do all of these things, I'm a little upset with myself. You know what I mean? I feel like I'm a little less, right? Because I could have done better. There's still part of me that ties my self-worth and how I feel about myself and the things that I deserve directly to the amount of work that I'm putting in and to what I'm achieving. And so that being said, the first way that I've started to fight perfectionism, I guess, is I've stopped reciting my mental to-do list out loud multiple times a day. Most of the time, before I go to sleep, I think about the things that I want to get done the next day. And when I wake up in the morning, I wake up with this mental checklist of things that I want to do, right? And the order in which I want to do them so that I can get all of these things done in the most efficient way possible. And I used to, without even really noticing it in the moment, I would list off this to-do list out loud sometimes, to just say it out loud, to reinforce it and remind myself kind of where I'm at. I would especially do this after I checked off one of the boxes and now I'm on to the next one, right? And it's like, all right, so we did that. Now we're going to do this and then the other thing. And in between those two things, we should have just enough time to get this thing done. And I don't necessarily think that this is a negative, but I think when you have such a lengthy to-do list every single day, it's unrealistic, the number of things that you are expecting to get done in a single day. One, you're setting yourself up for disappointment, which is only going to make you feel worse about yourself. And two, you're not allowing for very much flexibility within the day or the week or the month. And so often, I think these more spontaneous ideas, right? Sometimes things come into your day or into your life that were completely unexpected. And yet it's the best thing to happen to you that day, where it's like, oh, this happened on this day for a reason. Like, I'm going to shift my energy to this. And I feel good about it, because this doesn't happen every day. And when you recite that mental to-do list, you're not really giving yourself very much wiggle room to deviate from that plan, especially without feeling guilty. And so I have stopped. Sometimes I still start to just recite it inside my head, almost instinctually, but I've stopped saying it out loud. And that's been helpful for me, where I'm trying to be less outcome oriented and more so focus on the process so that I can focus on the task in front of me and really get into it, absorb all of the value from that task rather than just being focused on the end goal. I've also learned to trust myself and my judgment. I think so often when we suffer from perfectionism and tying how we feel to the work that we're doing, that kind of leads us to productionism and feeling like we always have to be doing something productive all the time. Otherwise, we're just wasting time. And so if I decide that I'm going to take a little bit of a step back from this productive thing that I'm doing because I need a little bit of space or a little bit of perspective, there was a time, and there is still part of me, again, more of a deep-seated part of me that feels a little guilty, that feels like, hey, you don't need time or space, just focus, power through, sit down, and get it done. But I've realized that time and space away from a particular task, especially something that you've been so focused on for a while, is productive and it's beneficial. You need space. It is part of the process. And so I've learned to trust myself and to trust my judgment, especially in my time away from work, in the time that I'm not doing something that's directly seen as productive, because I trust myself enough to know that I'm making the right decision for me. And I don't have to justify that to anyone else. One of the strange ways, I guess, not too strange, but that perfectionism just manifests itself in my daily life is that I like to have a really clean environment, especially when I'm going to be working or trying to focus. I think clutter for me is just like visual noise where it's a bit distracting. But there have been times, especially lately, where I'll have something out of place. Right? Maybe I'm getting ready to go to bed for the night and I've got a blanket just kind of strewn about on the couch. Maybe one of my dogs is laying on it and I don't want to disturb them because, right, they just look so cute while they're sleeping. And so I will purposely leave this blanket out of place and not folded just to show myself in the morning that, the sun will rise, the blanket will be here, and in 30 seconds, the blanket is folded and it's put back in its place and nothing bad happened. And this is so true for me throughout my healing journey in general. Practice is so beneficial in integrating these healthier behaviors into my life. I have to kind of prove to myself and show myself that everything is fine, right? That I'm actively going to go against this impulse that I have and nothing is going to change. And so sometimes I'll purposely leave things out of place just to kind of get myself used to focusing or functioning in an environment in which not every single thing is always put away and in place. I think it's really beneficial to be able to adapt to different situations, especially depending on what your work environment looks like, and to let go of that feeling like everything has to be perfect all the time. And I think the last way, probably the most beneficial way that I've started to heal from perfectionism is I've realized the value in mistakes. I think mistakes, especially having grown up with a narcissistic parent, anyone who has will understand what I'm saying. Growing up in that kind of environment, mistakes are terrifying. You never, ever, ever, ever want to do anything wrong. And so you're always thinking about what you're doing, what you're saying before you do it to avoid any possibility of making a mistake. You want to give yourself the best chance of always doing everything right so that nothing bad can ever be used against you or held over your head or leveraged in some way or another. And so you're so fearful if you actually do make a mistake. And it's looked at entirely as a negative. There is no benefit to your mistakes when you grow up with a narcissistic parent. And in my adult life, I've really learned the value of my mistakes, where I don't believe that any experience is truly negative if you can learn something from it. There's trial and error in business, in life, and it's so easy to really just kind of focus on the negatives, but more often than not, there's a lesson in that mistake. And so if you can learn something from a negative experience, then it's not entirely negative, in my opinion. And not only that, but making mistakes is one of the clearest indications that you are doing something. You're doing something that you've never done before. You're trying something new. You're growing and evolving. It's part of the process. And so if you're going throughout your life and you're never failing, you're never making mistakes, you're either doing something that you've been doing for a really long time that you've gotten really good at and you're just kind of staying in that lane, or you're not doing anything at all. You're not putting yourself out there and giving yourself the opportunity to make a mistake. And so I think realizing the positivity in mistakes and learning experiences in general, seeing that it is direct proof, it is evidence that I'm growing, right, has made me view my mistakes in a really different light. I welcome them much more than I ever had because I'm in a much safer environment where my mistakes don't directly translate to the treatment that I receive or to the way that I feel about myself. And so it's really difficult to let go of some of that perfectionism, to fight it, to start to heal from it, but it is possible. And the same that goes for the healing journey in general. It's a process. It's not something that's going to happen overnight. It takes a lot of energy and awareness and a willingness to want to get better. And even still, I am 5 years out of my parents' house. And I would say that I really kind of dove into healing and understanding and realizing my trauma about 8 months ago. And there are still times when I do feel like my worth and how I feel about myself is directly tied to everything that I checked off my mental to-do list that day. Or I want to put something away that I see is out of place, or I beat myself up internally about a mistake that I made. And even though those impulses are still there, they're much deeper than they ever were. They're not nearly as close to the surface. And at the end of the day, I don't allow them to actually dictate my feelings when I go to bed at night. I've realized where these things come from, right? I understand the roots. And so now I'm able to remind myself that, okay, the way that I'm feeling is a direct result of something that I experienced throughout my life, a lot of unhealthy behavior that I was exposed to. And just because I felt this way for a long time doesn't mean that I have to carry that with me for the rest of my life. I can teach myself these new behaviors, right? I can learn to understand the value in my mistakes. I can leave things out of place. I can trust myself and my decisions. And regardless of anything that I do, positive or negative, achievements, goals of mine, at the end of the day, if I strip all of that down, I'm still proud of the person that I am. I am worthy of love and affection and care simply for being me. And that has been hugely beneficial in my healing journey and in just getting to know myself and approaching life and relationships in general. So I think with that, that's kind of a perfect way to wrap up this episode. This was such a fun topic for me to dive into because it is something that hits really close to home. And I've talked a lot about perfectionism on TikTok, so I know that a ton of you relate to this topic also. So thank you so much to everyone who tuned in. We will be back next week with another episode of It's Not Normal, the podcast. Bye.